Thank you so much for streaming our latest message from First Baptist Church. Here at FBC, our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. We do that by thinking big, thinking small, thinking in, and thinking out. We hope that this message helps you as you continue to grow in your faith. If you would like to stay connected to FBC, you can visit our website at FBCLLOYD.ca, look us up on Facebook and Instagram, or download our free mobile app. Now here's the latest from FBC. Enjoy.
Hello again. Long time no see. I hope you guys are still doing well, recovering from any trauma, from fear that I might drop a baby. Hope you guys are having a great morning. What a cool morning getting to dedicate these kids and see this new life that's coming into our community. It's really cool. We're continuing on into week 5 of our Anatomy of a Disciple series. And if you were here 2 weeks ago, it's really nice this week to actually be able to see you guys. We've got the lights on, so that's great. Anyways, I wanted to take a second to say, well, first of all, I hope you guys have been enjoying the series. I hope it's been really good for you in your small groups and that you've been enjoying the series as you journey through it. But I want to take a second to say, if you've been here for a while, you'll probably notice that Doug and I sometimes have a little bit of playful jabbing at each other, kind of some rips on each other and stuff like that. But I had this realization, and I want to let you know, we're consistent in that. That happens in the office too. We're not just putting on a show on Sundays. That's our love language. It's just really rude sarcasm for each other. But we last week when Doug was talking about generosity, it was a really cool message, and it was encouraging and inspiring to be more generous, and how that's an important part of being a disciple of Jesus Christ, is to live a life of generosity. But I was thinking while I was sitting there listening to Doug speak last week, I was thinking this is a good message, and it was awesome to hear what he was saying. But I also started to reflect on something that maybe sometimes I take for granted, and that is kind of how good we have it here at FBC and how blessed we are. We have a lead pastor who not only brings us a good message about something like generosity, but that if you know him or if you get to know him, you know that he actually lives it out in his life. And I think a lot of places and a lot of churches or a lot of places you might go, don't have it that well. And I hope that we never take that for granted. And I know that I probably sometimes do too, but it's just neat to hear that from someone who actually is probably one of the most generous people I know, and to be encouraged in that way. And now, some of you probably think I'm like ramping up to like a really big epic burden. This is actually me saying something nice. My parents are here this morning, so I want them to think they did something right in raising me. And also, that's kind of an investment into the future, because I think they say 10 insults to 1 compliment, right? That's the ratio. And so that's kind of an investment. So I got like 10 burns coming up on other weeks. So anyways, I hope you guys don't take that for granted. I hope you guys take time to thank God for that. I hope you take time to encourage Doug, and I hope that you take time to pray for him sometimes, because we're pretty lucky to be hooked up with such a sweet lead pastor here. Anyways, this week we're talking about morality, and if you've been at FBC for a while, again, you'll know that this is something that we talk about quite a bit. We believe that the Bible sets a high standard and raises the bar really high for how Christians, followers of Jesus, should live their lives. That we should actually strive for a high level of morality. You know, the Bible says that God is holy and perfect and righteous. He has no immorality in him. So we believe an appropriate response to that is to pursue the same kind of elements in our lives. So maybe you're here for our iMessages series or our Out of Bounds series last year or something like that. You know, we talk about this quite a bit. I want to take a slightly different approach this morning. I'm going to spend the first little bit of time talking about kind of the importance of that striving, or that degree of morality in our lives in response to our personal relationship with Jesus Christ. We believe that's an appropriate response in your relationship with God. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, and then going to go to kind of step outside of that a little bit and kind of talk about our responsibility to the world around us, and how I believe that that's an important role in that. Your bulletins and your app notes don't have any fun fill in the blanks or anything this morning. I just kind of wanted to share a bit of thoughts, have a little bit of a conversation with you guys about that, and hopefully it's helpful. But before we do that, I just want to take a second to pray. So join with me if you would. God, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you that you are holy and perfect. And thank you that you are so good to us, and that you give us amazing things like these awesome little children that are born into our church community here, God. Help us be a church family that doesn't take what you've given us for granted and is responsible to the calling that you've put on our lives, God. that when you bless us and you meet with us, that we would respond accordingly. And I also just ask that you would speak to us this morning, God, and that you would continue to shape our hearts. We love you so much, God. Amen. So earlier this year, my wife Talisi and I, we went on a trip in the spring to Rwanda. And if you don't know where Rwanda is, it's this little country right in the middle of, kind of in the middle of Africa. It's kind of a weird shape, so it's hard to say middle, but it's kind of in the middle of Africa, and it's really tiny. If you've heard of it, you probably know maybe 2 facts, and that's that there was a huge genocide, and then the second one is that there was a movie about it. And that was kind of me going there. I didn't really know a lot about it. It's a pretty small place. It's a beautiful place. I've been to Africa a few times, and I've never been to Rwanda before, but I've been to a few other countries, and not every country in Africa is the same, but there are some similarities from place to place. And one thing that I found very similar in a lot of places I've been in Africa, and if you've been to some of the countries I have, you can probably relate, is that driving is like a very different experience there than it is here. When you get into a car in Africa, or in the countries I've been to, it's a little bit of a different feeling than when you get into a vehicle here. First of all, like the roads are like, not things that we would call roads a lot of the time. And then also, just the way driving happens is just like so different to here. So here's how I can maybe paint that picture a little bit. Where we were staying, there's this main road. It's in Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda. There's this main road, and it's 2 lanes. And there aren't really shoulders, so it's like truly 2 lanes, and there's a line down the middle. And so they call it 2 lanes. In my mind, what I think is actually going on there is I think that there are 3 lanes. There's a lane for traffic going each direction, and then there's this kind of invisible middle lane that doesn't have lines painted, but everyone just seems to know about it. And that's just kind of like the free-for-all zone, It's like if your lane isn't working for you, you hop in the middle lane and you just use that until like it's not usable anymore because you're like head-on with a bus, and then you move. And the other thing too is like the horn is like, that gets used more than the brakes. Here, if I honk my horn at someone, tells me, it's like, whoa, what's your problem? Like, was it really that big of a deal? There, like, if you haven't honked your horn like 6 times per minute, people are like, are you driving? Are you trying to get anywhere? So anyways, it's been my experience in Africa, and Rwanda is actually a little bit more organized than some of the other nations I've been to, but our friend there, he's a missionary from Kenya, and he picked us up from the airport when we landed, and I got into the back seat of his car, and the seatbelt didn't work. And so I said, oh, hey, Freddie, is there a trick to make the seatbelt work? And his response was, oh, Ryan, don't worry about it. There's no way you'll get a ticket for that here. And I was like, I'll tell you, I was in Malawi a while ago, and we got pulled over for speeding. I wasn't driving, but I mean, I could have been because I probably would have been. But we got pulled over for speeding, and it was like a $10 ticket, no demerits or anything. I don't care about the $10 ticket. That wasn't the question I was asking about the seatbelt. What I was saying is I've been to Africa before. I want a seatbelt. And like if there's like a life vest and like an airbag we can install back here, that would be really good too. But his response was, no, Ryan, there's no way you'll get a ticket. And it was just funny for me. I didn't really respond, but I'm just thinking, yeah, not really my concern. And throughout the week, I'd ride in the back, and sometimes his like 3-year-old would just be like cruising around on the back seat, like no seatbelt, no car seat, and it's just, it's just different, right? My concern was for my life. I wanted to leave Africa in a sitting position rather than in a box lane. I didn't want to get FedExed back home. And but my friend Freddie, he just had a totally different perspective on what I was asking there. And I think we often approach our morality in the same way. We have the wrong focus when we approach our morality. So what I mean by that is when we think about morality and moral standards, what we usually do is we look to a really subjective standard of the world around us. We start to compare ourselves to the norm, whether it's in our church or where we work or the people we know. And I'm not saying you sit down at home and you make a list of all your friends and it's like, well, how do we measure up to these guys? I don't think anyone does that. If you do, then you might have some issues that we should talk about a little further. But I think that people, that's generally how they govern their lives. And the Bible teaches that our world has a lot of darkness in it. And when your standard for how you would act and pursue and define morality in your life is by comparing yourself to others, saying, what do other people do? Or what can I get away with that wouldn't be like crossing the line in my context? What's kind of normal at our church and in our culture? Because that's very subjective. You go to, I was in Denmark, you'll see the pastor smoking out front with the youth before church. Now, Doug usually does that secretly before anyone gets here, but to us here, we would be appalled by that. But then they would come and see like how we eat when we do small groups and stuff, and they'd be appalled by our gluttony. And, it's so subjective, even in the same time and place, even in first world nations where you go. And so rather than having a focus of looking at other people around us for our moral standard, we should have a right focus and look at who God is. How do we compare to God rather than how do we compare to people? And the answer to how we compare to God is always maybe a little bit demoralizing in a way, but it actually gives us an accurate picture of where we stand and an accurate moral compass of where we should be headed. Instead of saying, what can I get away with in my church or cultural context, we should be saying, what pleases the God who made me? What brings him joy? What makes God say, man, I am so glad that I created him or her because they are actually living their life according to the moral standards that I've put out for them. But instead, we often have the wrong focus. And I think we need to take this more seriously than we often do. In our churches and small groups and even in our personal lives, a lot of the times I think when we read the Bible, we focus a lot on how loving and good and kind God is. And I think that's good. As we're reading, you see that his grace and his compassion page to page. And I think it's good because it's so true. The Bible has so much to say about that. But that's not a full definition of God. The Bible talks about how our God is just. How he judges sin, how he hates sin. That's not my language. That's the language of the Bible, that God detests evil. God is perfect, and he has no evil in him, and he hates it, and he judges it. And the Bible even says he pours out wrath. He punishes, and he disciplines evil. Now, we don't like talking about that, because a lot of people say, well, if God's so good, why doesn't everyone just go to heaven? Why would there be a hell if God is so good? And I think it's because he is so good. He's so good that he's loving and compassionate and gracious, but he's so good that evil has no part in who he is. He's so good that he judges evil. We all think that, or a lot of us, I think, sometimes think, oh yeah, well, if he's so good, everyone should just go to heaven. I think your opinion changes the second you die and you go to heaven. God's like, hey, I found you a nice place you can live over here. On one side, your one neighbor, his name's Adolf Hitler. Maybe you've heard of him. Osama bin Laden's on the other side. And you're like, oh, maybe I should rethink my perspective on that. And I'm not saying that I know where those guys are eternally, but you understand what I'm saying? We all believe in justice to some degree. It's just where we draw the line. And a lot of times I think we're more focused on where we draw the line and where people around us draw the line than who God is. And he is good and he is perfect. And yeah, he punishes sin, but he also offers grace because he is that good. I don't know why all of us compare ourselves and find our standard in culture around us and people around us. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's just selfish desire. It's like, I want to live my life like this. So you Google, is there someone out there who has this opinion that this is moral and good? And you can find anything. But we do, so that we can live our lives the way we want to. But check this out. This is what Jesus says in Luke 12:4-5. He says, I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has the authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. He's talking about God there. Now, this verse is intense. This isn't like if you go over to your friend's house and they've got like that, the Christian decor that people have. You walk in the front, they've got like, their family's life verse with the flowers swirling around, maybe some doves painted on the wall. You don't read the verse like Luke 5, fear the one who can like throw you into hell after you're dead. That's not people's life verse on the wall. You show up for dinner at some friend's house, you've never been there, you walk in, you see that, it's like, yeah, fear the one who throw you into hell. Your kids get in the car, we're out of here. These people are psychos, and this is crazy. This isn't like the type of verse that you tattoo on your arm and be like, yeah, check it out. I could put like some cool like stars and a rainbow and, hell, But it's truth. And it's what Jesus is saying. And I think a lot of times we get ourselves into trouble by ignoring it. And James 4-12, I think, really balances this idea of God's goodness, his grace, and his justice. In a verse, he says, there is one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. Because he's saying he's so good that he can save, and that salvation, that saving grace, that forgiveness is available to anyone. They just have to accept it. But if you don't, on the other hand, there is punishment. There are consequences for your actions. And that makes sense. See, when I was asking Freddie about the seatbelt, I don't care about $10. I mean, when we were in Malawi and we got a speeding ticket for $10, I told my friend Joe, I'm like, just speed all the time. I got a bunch of $10 bills in my pocket, just open it up. What I cared about was my life. Freddie's focus was different than mine. 2 weeks ago, I was at Briarcrest Seminary for a week taking a mod week class there. is actually on homiletics, which means preaching. So if you don't see me improving soon, let me know and I'll tell them to give me a refund. But on my way back on the Friday night, I was driving home, and it was about 7 p.m. It's pretty dark, and I was close to this town called Peyton. If you don't know where that is, it's close to Maidstone. If you don't know where that is, it's close to Lloydminster. And if you don't know where that is, then you might have an issue. But so I was driving, I'm like 40 minutes from home, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, out of the dark, Bambi and his two friends decide to just book it across the highway right in front of me. And I'm here to tell you today that Bambi is resting with his mother now. And I nailed that deer so hard, he went flying up my windshield and all that. So shortly after I called Talcy, but I was thinking to myself, what if someone was there and they called Talcy, they called my wife, and they're like, hey, just want you to know, Ryan hit this deer, cranked him, flew over on the side of the road. If Talcy's first question out of her mouth was, oh, is the deer okay? I mean, I'd be like, what's wrong with you? That would be the wrong question. That would be an inappropriate and pretty insensitive question. That's more like what I would ask, So no, Talcy obviously didn't ask that first. She said, how's the van? No, there's one thing that mattered in that situation, and it's how I was, because you guys need my beautiful face around here at FBC. I really just set myself up there for a burn on Doug, but I'm not this week. I'm not doing it. Okay. She asked how I was, obviously, and I was fine. Bambi, on the other hand, was not fine. In your small groups this week, you're going to be watching this video about how he talks about, in this idea of morality, how people are often driven to one extreme or another, often to this one extreme of legalism or to this other extreme of license, or what some people might call liberty. And I think a lot of this is because our focus gets skewed. We're asking the wrong questions. We're approaching this in the wrong way. And legalism and license both kind of come from a good place a lot of times, but they end you up in a really dangerous, unhealthy place on a spiritual level. So first of all, legalism, I think, often comes from people who genuinely want to do good with their lives. They want to be holy. They want to be pure. They want to pursue God. They want to look like him. They want to live according to his laws, but they get so fixated on their own actions and what they can do that they forget that they are saved by grace and not by their own actions. It's not like there's anything we can do to make ourselves good enough in comparison to the perfect God who created us. Or on the other hand, in license and liberty, what we do is sometimes it's good because people focus on God's grace so much and they love his grace and his forgiveness and they recognize that it's him that saves them and not themselves. But then we go overboard. And we're just like, well, then it doesn't really matter what I do because God's forgiveness is so big. We think we're doing this amazing big job of making God's grace big because we continue to test it. And we were just singing this song that talks about how forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. And I think in liberty and license, we often make it so that it's not very precious at all. It's kind of like it's on free refills at McDonald's on the tap or something like that. Imagine if you're a parent and you sit down with your child and they've done something wrong and you sit down with them and you're upset that they've done something wrong, but you sit down and you decide, I'm not going to give you any consequences. I'm just going to forgive you. I want you to know that I love you and I want better for you and I forgive you, no consequences. If your kid walked away from that and they were like, sweet, man, my dad is forgiving. I should exercise his forgiveness more, and just went out and did those things more and did worse, that would be the opposite results of what you were hoping for. And I think that's what happens in license and in liberty. In the book of Romans, if you haven't read it, it's this big theological treatment. A lot of it's pretty intense. A lot of it has to do with this idea of salvation. It's this area of theology called soteriology, just this theology of salvation, where there's this tension between what does salvation look like? How are we saved? How do we encounter God's grace? And for a lot of chapter 5, what Paul is talking about is he's saying, you guys got to stop trying to be good enough, and you got to understand that God loves you and he forgives you and he's good enough and his grace is good enough. But then, following on with that idea, in Romans 6:1-2, this is what Paul says. He says, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? You've died to sin if you're a follower of Jesus. You can't live in something that you've died to. It's only death there. God has offered you life. And I believe that God exists somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. He takes the good from legalism and the good from license, and somewhere in the middle is this healthy balance where God is saying, my grace saves you, but then my grace should also compel you to choose and to pursue morality. His grace says, let me be your compass. Stop comparing yourself to others and compare yourself to me. I forgive you, but I don't want you to live in the death that I set you free from. We hear the statement in church sometimes, maybe you've heard it, where people say, you need to be in the world, but not of the world. That's not a quote from the Bible. I think sometimes we think it is. Arguably it's supported by the Bible, but people talk about being in the world and of the world, but not of the world. And I think one of the problems is that usually we just focus on one of those statements. It's hard for us to focus on both. So we say, I gotta be in the world, I gotta be relevant, I gotta look like other people, I gotta do the things people do, I gotta speak the same way, I gotta live my life the same way so I can be relevant. And so we conform to our culture. Or on the other hand, I think sometimes we say, but we see the part where it says, be not of the world, and we put up walls and form this holy huddle, and we're like, let's make a small group and let's reject the world because it's dangerous and it's evil and it's dark, and we don't want to touch it, we don't want to infect ourselves. And I think both of those are really wrong perspectives. We shouldn't retreat from the world, but we also shouldn't allow ourselves to just conform to the world. We should be people who interact with our culture because God's moral call to us is so high. I believe that as you pursue God's morality, his call to righteousness, as he works in your heart, what will start to happen is you'll see the darkness. You'll see the brokenness. You'll see the injustice. You'll see the need in the world, and the natural response is that your heart will break. You'll say, I need to make a difference. As disciples, we're called to be leaders. Maybe you don't think of yourself as a leader, but Jesus says as a disciple, you're called to be a leader. You're called to be a light in a dark world and lead people into light. That's the call of being a disciple. Good leaders don't just hide out in their bedroom because they're scared of those that they need to lead. Good leaders also don't show up and just try to be like those that they need to lead. Good leaders show up, and because their lives are a little different, they're able to give people that they lead something to follow, an example to strive for. They make a difference in the lives of those that they lead. They make a difference in the lives of those that they interact with, and that's what we're called to be. Usually when I get up here on a Sunday morning, I kind of do what I've been doing for the last 15 minutes or whatever, and I present some ideas and argue and kind of push you guys towards something. The Bible, however, is 2/3 of it about is narratives. That means stories. And I don't often share a lot of stories from the Bible. And I thought maybe I would just share a couple of people who I think embrace this idea of God's light and God's morality filling them to the point where they saw their culture and they said, something needs to change here, and they made a difference. I'm going to share with you a couple stories, and then we'll call it a day. So if you read it's probably about 2 Kings chapter 22. I should have written it down. There's a story of this king named Josiah. So what's been going on is he's in the southern kingdom of Judah, and his father Ammon was a king that had ruled for, I think, about 2 years and was assassinated. So Josiah took the throne when he was about 8 years old. So before him was his dad Ammon. Before him was his king Manasseh, who ruled for a long time. And the Bible says that these were really, really, really evil kings. These were bad dudes. They were leading the country astray spiritually. They were making all kinds of bad decisions. They were engaging in their own kind of personal sins, and they were terrible leaders for their country. So Josiah becomes king at about age 8, which seems crazy to me, but he ends up being one of the best kings in the Old Testament. What happens is when he's about 26, he has some people working on the temple, and they're kind of doing maintenance, they're kind of like janitorial work and stuff like that. And one of the priests finds what they call the book of the law, so what we would call the Bible, and he finds it. It's hidden somewhere in a back corner because the country hasn't needed it for a while because that's not what they're living by. And so he brings it out, he gives it to Josiah, King Josiah's secretary, and the secretary comes to Josiah and he's like, oh, look what we found. We found this book. So Josiah's like, let's hear it. Let's see what it has to say. So the secretary, he starts turning the pages and he starts reading to Josiah. And what Josiah hears are words that are like, that paint a picture that where they're at as a nation is so dark and so evil. And it says that it hits Josiah so hard that he falls down and he tears his robes off. Now, we promote Bible reading here at FBC, but we don't think it should lead to nudity. We think you can keep your clothes on when you read your Bible, unless you're single and at home by yourself, whatever. But, we don't want to hear about it. But Josiah, he's broken. He starts weeping. He says, my nation is in so much trouble. There's so much darkness. So he could have hidden. He could have said, all right, well, we'll read this book of the law. We'll get a few of us together. We'll do that, and we'll just try to have nothing to do with our culture. Or else he could have said, well, people aren't doing this. So I don't know if I can do this. No, he's a good leader. So he said, this is truth. I'm going to go and I'm going to change things. And he revolutionizes the nation. Unfortunately, if you read the Old Testament narrative, more evil kings come and they bring darkness back in. But Josiah makes a change. A guy who became king when he was 8, and at 26 decided, I'm going to change this place. Don't tell me you can't be a leader. And then if you read in 1 Kings, I think around chapter 17, what's going on is in the northern kingdom, Israel, there's this king, and he's like the worst. His name's Ahab. He's got this wife named Jezebel, and she's brutal. And they're dead, so I can say that about his wife without him beating me up. But they're awful. You might have heard when you were during our 7 Deadly Sins series, Gord was talking about how they killed this guy so they could steal his vineyard. They wanted a grape farm so badly that they killed the guy, and they're terrible. And they're systematically killing off all the Christian leaders, what the Bible calls prophets, and they're like massacring them. And so there's this guy named Obadiah who had hid 100 of them in the caves just so they wouldn't be found, and they're hiding for their lives. And so this prophet named Elijah shows up, and this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible because it's so epic. He shows up and he says, that's it. Enough is enough. This guy should have been hiding in a cave just trying to stay alive, and he said, that's enough. So he sends a message through Obadiah to the king, and he says, meet me on the mountain and bring along with you all the prophets of your false gods. They had been serving false gods. One of them was Asherah, another one was Baal, and these 450 prophets for this false god named Baal. He says, meet me on the mountainside. Bring them. Bring your boys. It's just going to be me against all of you. So they show up. Elijah should be dead at this point, but they haven't killed him yet. And this is what he does. He takes 2 bulls as a sacrifice. He slaughters one over there, and they slaughter one over here. And he says, okay, prophets of Baal, that one's yours. And what I want you guys to do is I want you to pray to your God. And if he sends fire and burns this slaughtered bull up, he's true. He's the true God. And Elijah knows that means that he would be killed and that the country would continue to follow down that path. So the prophets of Baal, they start singing, screaming, praying, doing all these things, shouting day and night, and Elijah's there talking trash on the sidelines. He's like, oh, sing louder and stuff like that. That's like my only move at basketball, so I can like really resonate with the trash talk. But he's like, maybe you gotta be louder. They start cutting themselves and like pouring blood out of their bodies, thinking this is gonna do something. They go like day and night, nothing happens. And then Elijah shows up. And I think all that's going through Elijah's mind at this point, I'm transplanting myself there, is like, screw you. You are going to see something crazy happen here. Because what he does is he doesn't just make this happen, but he goes and gets a bunch of buckets of water and starts dumping them on the bull. He's soaking this thing, drenches it. Then he goes, probably with a really smug look on his face, probably looks over at the prophets of Baal, and he's like, yeah, praise, boom, fire. I don't know if Elijah's as arrogant as I would have been in that situation. Maybe not. But boom, fire. And so then what happens is Elijah goes and he kills these 400 prophets, and there's a bunch of reform and stuff in the nation, and it's pretty amazing. Now, I'm not encouraging that part of the story. Don't go slaughter people who are teaching something different than you. But this is a man who should have been in hiding for his life. He said, enough is enough. My world's broken around me. There's need. People are in trouble. And he risked his life for them. Because God's morality, God's law, God's standard had come so alive in his life. That was Jesus' life here on earth. Jesus came here, he didn't hide from people. He hung out with hookers, he hung out with tax collectors, thieves, sinners. He also hung out with church people, Christians, religious people who one day killed him. Hung out with everyone. He said, I just want to be part of this world and I want to respond to the need. He'd feed the hungry, he'd heal the sick, he'd give his life for sinners who needed forgiveness. Jesus came and engaged with the culture. He stood up for what was right, which begins with living rightly in your own life. This past week leading up to Remembrance Day, I don't really know. You can like sit down with some people and they can tell you all these war stories and about the war and stuff. I'm not really that kind of a history buff. But so I spent some time this week, because I think I often take it for granted, reading some like Canadian war stories leading up to Remembrance Day. And I actually want to share with you one of them because it's kind of epic, but to me, it kind of paints a picture of what we're talking about this morning. There's this guy 99 years ago, so in World War I, and his name was Robert Spall, and he was fighting in a Canadian battalion, and they had kind of become cornered in this trench, him and his battalion, by German troops. So they're in this trench, and they're basically just like, if we try to run, we're dead. If we stay here, we're dead. So either way, we're kind of hooped. And so what Robert does is he decides, no, you know what? That doesn't work for me. So he grabs a machine gun, hops out, and just starts mowing down Germans with this machine gun. And he tells the guys in his battalion, he says, just run, get out of here, go. So all of them escape alive, except for Robert, who kills a bunch of Germans and then eventually gets taken out himself, and he laid down his life for them. Now, there's no real spiritual context to that story. I don't know if he believed in Jesus or anything like that. But this is someone who is willing to make sacrifices, someone who is willing to live his life to a standard. Not saying, would someone else in this trench do this? Someone who's willing to climb out of the trench. Elijah was someone who was willing to risk his life and stand up for what was right. Josiah is someone who is willing to make changes in his own life and say, this needs to happen in the world around us. Jesus was someone who was willing to lay down his life to respond to the needs in this world. I believe that as you pursue morality in your life, as you pursue God's righteous standard, if your focus is right, rather than comparing yourself to the world around you, if you compare yourself to God, he will drive you to a moral standard that will start to break your heart for the need in this world, whether it's spiritual or physical or social need. And he'll use you to make a difference. We just dedicated a bunch of children today, and they've been born into a world that has a lot of darkness in it. A world that has a lot of sin, a lot of need, a lot of brokenness. And as they grow up, how much that continues or how much that changes is up to us. And how they see it modeled to make a difference and bring light to a dark world like that depends on us. And I hope that we'll be a church that takes that seriously, that looks at a God who's holy and perfect, that hates sin and says, I don't want to live my life according to our culture. I want to rise to God's standard, and I want to make a difference in the world around me. That'd be really cool if that was our church. Let me pray for you guys. God, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you that you love us. Thank you that you are holy and perfect and good. Please use us to change the world around you. Please use us to be models to others, to be a light in the darkness, God. We love you so much. Amen. Have an awesome week, guys. Thanks for being here.